God in heaven, just look at the state of my trousers. I mean, this really won't do. I can't address people like this. It's like being dragged through a plowed field backwards. Oh, never mind. Have to do. Oh. Well, good evening, my friends. Good evening, one and all, by our little fireside. Now, I must apologize, my friends, for my somewhat disheveled appearance. I hope you will all understand that Halloween for a collector of ghost stories is rather the busy time of year. I, for one, have been up in Whitby, in Yorkshire, hunting vampires. I mean, as one does. I don't know if you've ever tried to hunt a vampire yourself, but they can be tricky blighters, especially at night. We should really have been hunting them in the day, shouldn't we? Don't know why that never occurred to us. Well, can't be helped now. Now, I didn't want to miss our engagement, my friends, our regular engagement. Speaking of engagements, that's exactly the subject of tonight's tales, in fact. I did say to you that we were going to be discussing weddings and the like, and marriages. It's upon my mind because I am facing down the barrel of my 10-year anniversary. I couldn't imagine it had been quite so long. It's been such a happy 10 years, which is all to the good, of course. Is one supposed to get a gift at these times? I never know. Well, many marriages, unfortunately, aren't so happy. And some of them end rather terribly. And that is our subject of tonight's tales, in fact. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Perhaps I should begin at the beginning. That's how these things are generally done. So, Ronald McEwen, when he was just a lad of about 16 years of age, he went to vacation at his uncle's rectory. It was a pang of conscience that had tweaked at the Reverend Applegarth that up until now his nephew had been somewhat neglected since his dear sister's passing. And, of course, he should really be spending some time with his cousins, the two boys of the Reverend, who would be holidaying from their public school with him. Now, the Reverend Applegarth loved a quiet house. And in fact, his residence at Swanmere, his country retreat, was buried in books. And the holidays became something of a trial for him, it should be said. And to have three rather than two hobbledy-hoy lads charging up and down stairs at all hours of the day probably made no odds, to be fair. So it was to be that Ronald would meet with the young Applegarths. Now, they were not ill-natured, those two boys of the Reverend, but Ronald did find himself rather the butt of their jokes quite often. So he took himself to saying little around them, and unfortunately for him, he made the mistake of dropping at one luncheon the subject of spooks, and that he believed in them. Well, it was with rather a fiendish glee that the other two boys seized upon this as an opportunity to torment their cousin. Jack, the elder of the two, turned and said, "Oh, really? You believe in superstitious nonsense like that? Good Lord, there's no evidence for ghosts whatsoever. All accounts of them are second-hand or third-hand or fourth-hand at best. But have you ever seen one yourself? No? Would you care to?" Well, Ronald said that he had not seen one himself, but he had spoken with others that had, and he considered the matter for a moment. Yes, he answered, he would like to see a spook, a ghost, as he would term them, rather less disrespectfully, if he had the chance. Oh, really? Well, I think we might be able to give you the chance, said Jack. We don't have any castles here around the Lake District, but there is a house nearby, a house in Swanmere that is said to be haunted. So, what do you say? Do you fancy going down and having a look, spending the night there? Of course, it would be fatal to say no and to admit weakness. So Ronald considered what his answer should be. Well, if you chaps don't believe in ghosts, no doubt you wouldn't be afraid to sleep there. No doubt, said Jack. Alfred, the younger, didn't say anything upon that subject of sleeping in a haunted house. Well, if you go and aim for a look at it, I'll go too. Whatever you do, I will. It seemed to be a good way out of the matter. It was a Sunday, and so on their way to church, they headed off to have a look at the property. The boys assured them was haunted. The Reverend was able to furnish them with the keys, but they didn't go inside upon this occasion. Now, it was only about half a mile down the Portsmouth Road. There were only 2 or 3 villas about the place, all hemmed in and shrouded with shrubbery. The lads effected an entrance by hopping over the fence, and this particular property was rather overgrown. Clearly, no one had been living there. The heavy iron gates were shut, and, point of fact, were chained and padlocked. And so Jack led the way, took Ronald around to the back where there was a rather rustic seat in the back of the garden. He sat them down there and pointed up and said, "That window there, that's where they see them at night." "See what exactly?" asked Ronald. "Oh, well, whatever the apparition is. They say, in fact, that a light appears behind that faded blind up there," and there was indeed a faded red blind in the window. The front of the property had rather large bow windows, which were all shuttered and boarded up. But this one window, back of the property, was entirely open except for the faded red blind. Well, they say a light can be seen, and then a figure appears and does something or other. That is the apparition that is always seen here. It's commented about in town quite often. So, are you game to go in and investigate the house? Are we to go tonight? Oh, well, not tonight. It's Sunday. The governor might get a bit upset if we weren't there for dinner, or if you got any sniff of hijinks. Tomorrow. Why don't we go tomorrow? Clearly, he was going to be hoaxed, and whatever hoax it was needed more than the rest of the day in preparation. Ronald did not expect to see any kind of genuine phantasm. He was quite unbelieving of it all. But he was firm in his resolve that he was not going to back down, and if he was to be trotted out to see whatever sham apparition it was to be, his cousins would have to come too. So, Monday was agreed upon. At midnight, when all respectable inhabitants of Swanmere would be abed. Now, when they were leaving the household, the skies were clear, the starlight was blazing, but it was the dark of the moon, and so Jack took an electric torch with him. But it was only Jack who came along. Alfred was nowhere to be seen. Jack explained the matter, that he'd caught ill, and a poultice need to be applied to him so that he could spend the night resting up. A likely story. Alfred had made sure to make some hacking coughs and things through the day so that it would explain his absence for the night. So clearly he was the one to present the sham apparition. Now, Ronald and Jack made their way along the Portsmouth Road, not saying much to each other. Ronald was rather resentful of the whole hoaxing experience, and Jack seemed rather amused by some private joke or other and smiled quietly to himself. They made their same way over the fence into the property, in through the tangled garden to where they would have the best view of the house. And the house sat there, silently, its black silhouette even blacker than the night around it. "Oh, here's the best place for you to be able to see the window," said Jack. It was the rustic bench. Clearly, this was the spot for the hoaxing to be done. So, Ronald did not refuse, but he sat down on the bench, making sure that his back was to the bole of a tree, so that it would at least protect him somewhat from any attack from the rear. And he waited there a good 5 or 6 minutes, and he could hear some rustling in the shrubbery, so no doubt something was about to happen. At that moment, Jack did point something out, but his voice was changed somehow. There is a light. I can see a light now." And indeed there was. There was a light behind the red blind in the window. Just a candle flame or some such. And there was a figure that passed in front of it, across the blind, somewhere behind it. Perhaps Alfred had got all the way up into the property? Surely not. Surely he wouldn't risk tangling going in there all on his own. Or maybe the younger Applegarth was made of sterner stuff than Ronald realized. But at that moment, whatever person it was within tweaked the blind to one side as if to look out into the garden. Such a natural human affectation. But then something altogether different happened. The light had been growing beyond a candle's flickering flame towards a lantern's blaze, and now it was getting even more, like the whole room was ablaze. And suddenly there was a loud crash out into the garden, like the whole window had fallen out, and now there was a figure. There was a figure stood up there on the windowsill, a figure dressed all in white, as perhaps all good apparitions are. And then the figure leapt and dropped into the garden. Somewhere there was a pistol shot and a scream, and then the figure in white raced forward, rushing past Jack and Ronald, but as it raced past through the shrubbery, it didn't make any kind of a sound. Well, Jack, at his side, let out a strangled cry, as if in terror. And if it was affected, if it was an act, well, it was a jolly good one. Jack was clutching at Ronald's sleeve, in fact. Come away. I've had enough of this. Let's come away. It's all finished anyway." And the light was in fact dying from within the window. So whatever it was that had happened, that was clearly it for the night. "Well, quite an effective ghost you have in these parts," said Ronald, impressed at what they had managed to effect between them. But he followed Jack Applegarth as he made his way through the tangled shrubbery and back out over the fence. At that moment, he heard a sound behind him. Now the apparition was making a sound, clambering over the fence. Ah, there was Alfred, and he had some white sheet or other clutched in his hands. But the younger Applegarth was crying, snivelling to himself and hugging the thing. "Oh, you decided to join us, have you?" said Ronald. "Didn't need the poultice all night, after all. I'm terribly sorry to have put you out if you've come and joined us. I hope it wouldn't make you unwell." "You're all right, Alfred." Alfred didn't say anything. Nothing at all. He just clutched the sheet tighter and tighter to him as they stomped their way down the Portsmouth Road. "It's a damn good show you chaps put on," said Ronald. Alfred finally found his voice. "I had nothing to do with whatever that thing was. Never going there again. Well, whether it was a phantasm or not, Ronald never found out. Whether it was some natural phenomenon. And here we must take a 20-year break within our narrative, because the Reverend Applegarth passed away, and Ronald lost touch with his cousins and hadn't seen them again. Now, Ronald had grown into quite the man of business. His business empire had grown and grown. He'd done very well for himself indeed. And now, at the princely age of 36, he found himself, well, doing rather well in the world, and certainly capable of comfortably keeping a bride, which was something he had neglected the field of romance up until this point. Now, I make no bones that this is not a romance story, so we'll skip over all of that sort of bit. But it was back towards Swanmere that the search for a bride took Ronald McEwen. You see, he had been to friends of his wedding, the Parkinsons, and he had spied a rather beautiful bridesmaid, Lillian her name was, on that occasion. And he had asked about her and managed to effect for himself an invitation to a weekend away at the country home of the Parkinsons, on an occasion when Lillian would be staying there. So it was Swanmere, in fact, that the Parkinsons had settled themselves within. A very, very nice villa, in fact. Now, Mrs. Parkinson met Ronald at the train station, and she managed to pilot the Pony and Trap herself, taking him through the town. "Have you ever been here before?" she asked of Ronald. "Yes, when I was a good deal younger, I stayed with my uncle here once. Unless the place has changed a good deal, I do remember it being a good deal smaller place. Yes, it has rather developed, as all places do, rather in the place of being spoiled, I'm afraid. But we were very, very lucky to find our place. One of the older buildings, in fact, although we've spent a good deal of time and effort doing it up. Very lucky indeed." Now, Ronald did not recognize the direction he was taking. He did not even recognize the Portsmouth Road. And he didn't recognize those iron gates that he went through, this time without the padlock and the chain barring the way. Neither did he recognize the gardens and the shrubberies that were now very well kept and well pruned. But the big bowed windows, unshuttered and barred now, did strike something of a chord in him. When he went up to dress for dinner in his room, he noted that he had a very, very large window that looked out across the back of the garden. There were stirrings of a recollection in the back of his head, but nothing concrete. Now, he went to dinner, which was charming, but all of that is romantic nonsense. Lillian was lovely, and she sung a very good song after dinner, so on and so forth. Now, it had put the Swanmere experience out of Ronald's mind, his 20 years ago, staying with his cousins. But when he retired for bed, looking at that big window out into the gardens beneath, he looked up and he wondered for a moment and pulled down the blind. But of course, it was a perfectly ordinary Venetian, green in colour, so nothing untoward there, and he quite put the matter out of his mind. He went to bed for the night, but it was the morning when he woke up that the stirrings of recollection struck him, because as he saw the sun arising through the blind, it was a crimson hue that shined down upon him. Crimson blind hanging there. And as Ronald lay there in bed, he had the distinct feeling that he was not alone in the room. There was the sound of breathing, too. And as he tried to rise up from his bed, he found he could not. There was this distinct feeling of hands pinning him down and trapping him to the bed. It was a most unnerving sensation. Sleep stole over him again. Was it a sleep or was it some kind of a trance? He passed out. He woke again. This time, the morning light was flooding, no, through a green blind. It had been green, a simple green Venetian. Well, he put the experience to one side. Of course, those previous vacations spent there with the cousins hoaxing him and the like had played upon him in the night, and his night had given him nightmares, and that was all there was to it. It was no otherworldly experience. But when he went outside into the garden, winding his way along the path, he found that same rustic bench that he had sat on those 20 years ago. And he sat there again now, taking out a cigarette and lighting it and puffing away in the morning. His host, Peregrine Parkinson, came and sat beside him, puffing his morning pipe as well. "Very nice place you have here," said Ronald. "Oh, yes, passable enough, isn't it? Charming. Cecilia's quite taken with the place. Yes, absolutely charming. Although, bit of a shame. Notice some of the locals talk about it. They have a few bad things to say about it." "Really? What do they say?" "Oh, nothing. Stuff and rot, really. Ghost stories, if you have in mind for such things." No. What do they say, Peregrine?" "Oh, it's nonsense, really. I think it's just the place had been closed up for all those years. Perhaps thieves had got into the place and lit some candles and the like, and locals passing by had seen them. Or maybe coiners, counterfeiters, something like that, and someone up no good or something. Still, I just hope Cecilia doesn't get wind of it. She's of a nervous disposition at times, or she does seem to be. So I haven't mentioned to it. If you'd be a good chap and not mention this business either." "Of course, old chap, of course, whatever you think's best." And so Ronald didn't like to confide in his host, who already had his own thoughts on his mind, what he had experienced at the same house those 20 years ago, and indeed something of an experience of them last night. Well, the rest of the day was spent in leisure pursuits, the romantic stuff, going out on the lakes and boating and that sort of a thing. But Ronald realized that he may perhaps be staying in a haunted house now, and that he would be staying here for another 2 nights. Should he say anything to his host, or should he not? And, well, he could say to himself during the day that nothing bad could possibly happen to him, that ghosts could not affect the living. That was all well and good to say to yourself in the daytime, but at night, these things took on another complexion, of course. Still, he found himself, as bravely as he could, going to bed again at night. And he woke again in the night. There was a faint illumination in the room. That of a flickering candle flame, perhaps, coming from somewhere he couldn't quite see. There was that same sound, though. That sound of breathing. And yes, that flickering candle flame was casting shadows upon a crimson blind, not a green one. And then, at that moment, a figure walked across his vision from one side of the room to the other. Well, Ronald fell asleep again. Perhaps an unnatural sleep. He passed out. He awoke in the morning with more to concern him now. Dare he spend another night in the same room? If this presence was making itself felt more and more, what else would it do? And should he say something to Peregrine? I mean, what of other guests that might stay there? And what if another guest had a more open eye, as it were, as the spiritualists say, than he? Well, he resolved himself that he would say something to Peregrine when he was leaving. Of course he would. Thankfully, Lillian had not been placed in this room. Well, the final night had to be faced, and, resolved as he was, Ronald went to bed again. And he did wake up. Yes, he did. It was about 2 or 3 in the morning that he woke, and there was another light, like a candle flame, a little bigger this time, perhaps almost like an oil lamp. And in its light, yes, the crimson blind was there, but something else was there at the foot of his bed. A figure. Not flittering past him, but stood stock still, staring at him, staring directly at him. His eyes met the man. But even as he met the gaze, he realized that that flame, whatever it was growing bigger and bigger. And whatever this ghostly presence was, it did not take away from the fact that Peregrine's house might be ablaze. Surely he would have to warn everybody else in the house. He tried to cry out, to scream, but his voice would not respond. The figure stared at him. He stared back. The man in the flesh and the man who was flesh no longer. And the latter turned upon his heel and went over towards the crimson blind hanging there, tweaked it to one side, looking down into the gardens beneath. He cast his gaze back. The man looked terribly disturbed, pale and gaunt. And at that point, he tore the blind aside and smashed against the windows. And there was a crash as if the entire window had fallen out into the garden. And the man leapt bodily out of the room. Somewhere, Ronald heard a pistol shot and a scream. And then, unnaturally again, he fell asleep. Well, of course, in the morning, over kippers for breakfast, nobody else had heard anything untoward in the night. No scream, no pistol shot, no crashing of glass. But this would all have to be told to Peregrine. He had to know what manner of haunted property he lived in. And so, out in the garden, over a cigarette and a pipe once again, Ronald broached the matter, explained it all as best as he could to Peregrine, who took it all in his stride as best he could, seeming not to believe a word of it as he puffed upon his pipe. Well, look, chap, of course you've got the right to believe in all of this nonsense and hoaxery and all this business. I know what I saw, Peregrine. Well, yeah, but do you? I mean, you were hoaxed here once, some 20 years past, and perhaps all of that has acted upon your mind, old chap, and, well, you've dreamt various things whilst you've been here. I mean, I don't think it's really worth worrying Cecilia about. Well, look, if you don't wish to tell her, that's one thing, but perhaps you could close the room up. Turn it into a box room, a storage room, or something like that. Not easily, old chap. You see, Cecilia's quite taken with that room. It was what really sold the place to her, and, she wants to turn it into a nursery one day, point of fact. So I'd have to explain myself, really. And I don't really want to unpack the whole business to her. She might be understanding. I mean, what if you put Lillian in that room? For God's sakes, old chap. Yes, well, look, I understand that you think you've seen a lot of things whilst you've been here, but I really don't want to upset my wife. Well, what could Ronald do? He had reported the matter. He had put it in as strong a terms as he could, and if he went on and on about it, well, perhaps Peregrine would think him foolish or a madman or whatever. So he left and matters were going quite swimmingly with him and with Lillian, and there was an exchange of a ring, and all of that was progressing toward their happy day, in fact. But he received a letter from the Parkinsons, from Peregrine, in fact. Dear old chap, great to hear of your coming nuptials and the like. Wonderful. Terrible shame that myself and Cecilia won't be joining you. At least not together. There's been a bit of a misunderstanding between us. She's left to stay with her mother, in fact, and I've been turfed out on my ear and staying in a hotel. Unfortunately, the whole story and business that you told us came out somehow. Servants, they'd heard talk of it in town. Same story, in fact, as you heard. Not that we saw any ghosts or ghouls or anything within the household, but, well, Cecilia caught wind of it all and thought I'd been keeping stories from her. Well, I'd been lying to her, in fact, and she took the matter rather hard. There's nothing for it now, unfortunately. Hopefully things will resolve themselves, but I thought you might like to know. I had a search on the business. Turns out the house used to be owned by a doctor who used to treat lunatics there. There was a night where one of them managed to knock over a lantern or some such and set fire to his room. In fact, it was a devil of a job to put it out. But the chap tried to escape from the room and threw himself out of the window to his death. I don't know anything about a pistol shot or screams and the like. Maybe those things have been tacked onto the story at a later date, but very, very pleased to hear of your engagement, old chap. It's wonderful news. Terrible shame about mine. And so, friends, that was how the business ended. With Ronald and the like. What the truth of it was, one will never know. Devilish shame, though, about the Peregrines, Parkinsons. Can be the way of things. But my second story of the evening, friends, relates to a marriage, but a somewhat more sinister tone, I'm afraid. Relates to the passing of one of the members of that happy or not so happy union. Concerns a friend of mine who I visited a little while ago. Tom Enderby was his name. And I remember as I went and stayed at his house, I stood there in the hallway looking up at a painting of his recently deceased wife. Gloriana was her name. Gloriana, indeed. It's a good likeness, said Tom Enderby, although, of course, she was a bit older towards the end. I followed him down towards his smoking room, as it was. We'd been old school chums, but I'd been for a decade away in India before coming back and seeing him again. And when I found Tom now, he'd been a widower for some 4 years, which, to my mind, was actually a good job. I'd never really liked Gloriana, and I think Gloriana had shared that sentiment, or lack of sentiment, in fact, between us. The painting was beautifully captured, I have to say. She had not smiled upon any of the bachelor friends of her husband, Tom, and the painting certainly did not smile. It stared down with her fine, aquiline, cold features, with that striking Roman nose of hers, and those steely eyes. And these steely eyes still kept a watch over the household. When we went on into the smoking room, We closed the double doors behind us, and I could see Tom visibly relax, I have to say. Now, they'd been originally built as something of a nursery within the property, but they'd never had a family, and so the rooms had always been turned over towards Tom and his pipes and his tobacco, because Gloriana had said she'd hated the smell of the stuff. So whenever his friends, like me, had come over, we had had to smoke in there or not at all. Now, I remembered the rule and the room, but I was surprised to see Tom adhering to it, now that the lady of the household was past. I'd expected us to be smoking over the dessert dishes, but no, it was not to be. We installed ourselves in a couple of comfortable chairs by the fireside, and we sat there. As I say, Enderby had relaxed a little since coming into this room in the house, without his wife's influence there. But he was not looking well. He was looking very drawn. Was he still fretting over Gloriana and her passing? Maybe he was one of those chaps who had taken to depending upon a woman in their marriage, and now that she was no longer there, did not know what to do with himself. I mean, depending on a woman is all pleasant and well enough, depending on the sort of woman. But I could not imagine depending upon Gloriana. God, no. Evelyn, my wife, had some rather pretty sisters, and I resolved myself upon a course of action. Why don't you come down, old chap? Come and see us. Get yourself away from the place. Oh, I should like that. Very much, said Tom, and then in the next moment, next heartbeat, his face fell. If I can get away. Well, what is there to hinder you, old chap? Of course you can get away. I've rather stopped here. Keep the place together. You know how it is. What do you mean, old chap? Right? You've been rather hipped by this house, I feel. I think a change would do you good. Why don't you sell it? Or let it out and stay somewhere else? Oh, no, I can't, old chap. I'm a tenant for life now. It was my wife's house. It was part of her family. Well, then let it or shut it up. You could stay somewhere else. You've got the money for that. No, nothing hinders me. Nothing legal, anyway. It was an interesting tone he took on that phrase, nothing legal. Well, why don't you go out and see the world? Or else marry again? Yes, I had been in mind of that. Well, 4 years, old chap. I mean, no one would doubt the propriety of that. Yes, I had been in exactly the same mind, but no, nothing can come of it. Nothing good, anyway. What do you mean by that? I rather have it in mind to tell you a queer story, old chap. But I don't know what you all think of it, or of me, for that matter, for telling it. At that moment, he flicked his cigar directly into the fire. He did look rather pale. I did get engaged, in fact, after Gloriana passed. We broke it off, and I'm going to tell you why. Now, my wife had been on her deathbed for some time. She'd been in a coma, and the doctors told me that she might rally at some moment, come back to herself, back to consciousness, and she might be able to speak a final time, and I should hold myself ready for it. Well, this I dreaded more than anything. You see, Gloriana held marriage, the holy sacrament of it, in a very exalted light. And I feared that if she came to her senses, then she would, upon her deathbed, extract from me some kind of a promise, a dedication to her for the rest of my days that I would never remarry. Now, I was only in my middle age, and Gloriana had been a good deal senior to myself, and I didn't wish to give such a promise. I'm sure you can understand that. Well, I was sitting there, holding myself ready, miserably so, when the doctors came and found me, told me that she had awoken. Well, with some trepidation, I tramped up the stairs and I came into the room. And she was lying there, stretched out already like a corpse. Well, I came forwards, and she was finding herself conscious once again, and I had been told not to agitate her. Well, she said, "Tom, I know I'm dying. The doctors tell me so. I want you to promise me something." Well, of course, here was exactly what I was dreading, this promise. "I want you to promise me that when I die, you will cover my face with your own hands." Well, this was not at all what I was expecting. I was relieved. I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders, but I could not show it, of course. And I said, of course, anything that you wish. Anything that I wish. Yes, yes. You must cover my face with a particular handkerchief. It is in the cabinet in my room, in the top drawer. You will see it. You will be able to find it. There is nothing else within that drawer. It is a particular handkerchief that I cherish and treasure. You must cover my face with that. Of course, my love. Very well. And this was all she had to say. She drifted back out of consciousness once again, and she never recovered it. And when the undertakers came to find me, once she had been placed within her coffin, they asked me whether or not I wanted one final look at her. And so the duty was upon me. Reluctant, but necessary duty. And so I made my way up to that cabinet, and I found the handkerchief there, exactly as she said. The only thing there within the drawer was a particular cambric fabric, which had a monogram in each of the corners. I'd never seen her use it or drape it or wear it or anything like that. But I took it, and as my duty, I laid it there over her face. And a rather horrible thing happened. The fabric of the handkerchief drew itself down as if it had a mind of its own. It clung, drew itself tightly around her features, forming a perfect death mask of Gloriana. Well, with my nerves shaken, I threw back the covers and I slammed shut the coffin, and that was the end of the thing. Of course, the coffin was buried. I put up a very fine, fetching monument to her, and there had been no pledge, no promise. I knew that she would have wished it, but the promise had not been given. So, after a period of mourning of some months and another few months besides, that was when the Ashcrofts moved into the Lascaux's old house. Now, the Ashcrofts had a very pretty young daughter, Lucy, her name was. And she was very gentle and yielding and pleasant and not superior like Gloriana had been. And at this moment in the story, I realized that Tom probably wanted a contrast to his previous wife. It was very understandable. But he went on. Now, I got friendly with the family. I introduced myself. I was very desirous of her, and then Lucy seemed inclined towards me, and so the courtship progressed. Now, I was going to dinner one night. I went around there with the express intention of making my intentions felt. I bought a ring, very fetching diamond ring, and I had it within my jacket pocket. Now, as I was dressing for dinner, I cast aside my day handkerchief onto the floor whilst I was changing things about, and it caught my eye because it moved as if the wind had caught it, and it fluttered and blew. It seemed to inflate and mold itself. And it molded itself into the perfect face of Gloriana, laying there upon the floor, staring up at me. Well, it gave me quite a turn, I have to say. I grasped the fabric and flattened it and tossed it aside, and, well, I threw the thing into the fire and it burnt to a cinder at once. Well, after I had been quite so shaken as that, I could not play the young lover. I could not effect a courtship that night. I mean, of course, the thought of her corpse and her face and that death mask would be, well, it would come between my lips and Lucy's, and so the whole thing was off for that night at least. I waited a day or two for my resolve to return, and once again I was bold to the matter, and so I went around and made my proposal in the gardens, and it all went over well. Pear Ashcroft was disposed to the financial arrangements I proposed, and Mayor Ashcroft said that she would consider me her son at once, so all was going rather swimmingly. Until it was, Lucy and I were alone together. We'd got into the sitting room to discuss the whole length of the engagement and where we might honeymoon and all of that sort of a business. We had agreed on a date, and there was 8 weeks to prepare the wedding, so lots of things to discuss. But she was hard at work at her sewing, so much so, her attention was so on it, I was getting quite jealous of it, to be perfectly fair. I wanted to hold her hand and to gaze into her eyes lovingly, but no, she was ploughing away with the thing. It was a present for a friend, and she wanted to... But finally I managed to persuade her to set it to one side, and that's where the problem started. Because as I was talking to Lucy, her needlework, linen tea towel or something like that, started to ripple and blow and started to form a shape. Oh, good Lord! Do you see, Tom? That's a face in my sewing over there. No, I don't think so. It could be anything. It could be any shape. The wind's just caught it. Of course, I was saying such things whilst my mind was filling with dread, and I quite flattened it and cast her work over the back of the settee, and of course that would not do. I had made something of a faux pas there, and Lucy looked at me rather stricken. I tried to apologize. I don't think it had been a face. She had been quite struck by the magic of it, the enchantment of such a strange occurrence. So she looked over the back of the settee just as I was dashing around to try and pick the thing up. But she saw it at exactly the same time as I did. The thing had once again inflated and formed its shape. The perfect death mask of dear Gloriana. But that was not all. Some other sheet from somewhere or other had been found and laid out, and now it had wrapped itself around and formed the entire impression of a shrouded corpse lying there upon the floor. Well, as I leapt upon it to flatten the whole thing to pieces, Lucy screamed and screamed and screamed, and of course summoned her parents from the other room. They came dashing in, of course, very displeased with the ruckus, and Pear Ashcroft looked askance at me, and Mayor Ashcroft now had her sobbing daughter in her arms, and she was tearing me off a strip about the idea of Playing practical jokes and jests and the like. Practical jokes, really? Do you think so? I would create the dead effigy of my previous wife. Of course, I didn't say that, but yeah. Well, that night, I excused myself at the earliest convenience, and there was a day of gap between seeing the Ashcrofts again. But on the Friday, I was going back there. It had been arranged for a ride. And so I went and I saw Lucy, but she was a little cold and distant to me now. She'd got straight onto her horse and ridden off ahead, and the groom helped me onto mine. He informed me that Miss Kingsworthy was staying for luncheon, and so we should not be late to the table. Well, unfortunately, Miss Kingsworthy had been a friend of Gloriana's. I didn't realize that the family knew her. Maybe they had just made this acquaintance. Well, I rode after Lucy as swiftly as I could. She did not seem to be in a mind to be caught, and so we rode separately for a good long while. Eventually, I managed to catch up with her and speak to her. There was a cold set to her features now, not so warm and yielding. She said to me, "Do you know what Miss Kingsworthy said to us? She said that your previous wife had certain views about marriage, and that she thought it very strange that you and I were to be wed. She thought that Gloriana, was it? Oh, dear God, don't say her name. Would have made you promise not to marry again." Well, here I was on safe ground. I did not have to lie. I said no such promise was ever given. I did admit this. I said, "I do believe that my past wife perhaps would not have wanted me to remarry. But she never made me promise or swear such a thing. I never did. So surely you will not let this, nor the influence of Miss Kingsworthy or any tittle-tattle from the village influence the feelings that we have grown up between the two of us. Surely not." Well, Lucy softened at this. There clearly were still feelings for me within her breast. But she said this, "Well, if it had only been that, no, of course. But Tom, what happened the other night was so very horrible. And, well, if it was a one-off, something like that happening, then fine, I can understand. But if it should happen again, and if it should keep happening, well, I can't imagine anything more horrible." Well, there it was. There was the ultimatum. She still cared for me, still had feelings for me, still would marry me, but she would not be marrying a haunted man. Could I really blame her? Well, there was only one hope, really, that whatever power it was that Gloriana had after death had all been spent in that appearance. That was all I could hope. Well, we finished out the rest of the ride. Miserable it was. Lucy's horse flung a shoe. So we were late back. We missed Miss Kingsworthy, which was something of a relief to me. We had been told that there were some cutlets keeping warm for us, which was an over-exaggeration. They were lukewarm at best. But we sat there to our late supper. And as we sat there, and I was playing the light-hearted young lover to try and keep things warm and cordial between us, but nothing could have been warm or cordial about that luncheon. It was an ordeal I will never forget. Because as we were speaking, to the side, not within the eye line of Lucy, I saw the tablecloth begin to billow, begin to blow, begin to form itself into a shape. It's the shape of a face, once again. Well, I kept my hand upon it. I kept my fingers drumming upon the tablecloth to keep it flattened down, drumming upon the dead face of my wife. I kept the subject upon anything else, anything at all. Art, music, literature, whatever came into my mind. But I was so fixated, so focused on keeping that down and flat, I had not been watching the rest of the room. And as Lucy got up to change for the evening, she turned and she saw a hat of hers. It was a favourite of hers, in fact, just upon the side table. Some piece of linen or other, maybe it was a serviette, I don't know. Some piece of linen or other had started to float and form that shape, and it was underneath her very own hat. It wore it like a crown in triumph as it stared at us in the room, that face with those cold eyes, with that high Roman nose, fixed its gaze upon us, and there was a triumphal twist to the smile. Well, Lucy's scream on this occasion was only short, because she fainted dead away, fainted in my arms, fainted so badly it was a full swoon. It took doctors to revive her. All the while, Père and Mère Ashcroft were in a flap and screaming the place down themselves. Well, I stood as long as I could with looks of indignation peppering through me, stood until I knew that Lucy was revived and well again, and then I made my excuses and I left. Well, the next day, I received a note from the Ashcrofts. Of course, Lucy would not be marrying me, not any time soon, and the ring was returned to me. And that, my dear old chap, is why I cannot marry again. And that is all there is to the tale, all there is to be told. What do you make of it? Because I don't know. Oh, well, my friends, I must apologize again because there is something of another lull to our meetings. Not 2 weeks, but 3 upon this occasion, simply because I am taking something of a little jaunt away to celebrate this 10-year anniversary of my happily married wife and I, thankfully, not like poor Tom Enderby. But in 3 weeks' time, on the 22nd of November, we shall return by the fireside again, and we have a treat in store for you, that of J. Sheridan Le Fanu, the Mr. Justice Harbottle. So, if you have the bottle for it, you're very welcome to return. To join me again, until such a time, I wish you all a pleasant evening and the sweetest dreams. Good night.